Tonight we're descending into the shadowed halls of Hawkins National Laboratory, where Cold War paranoia and government experimentation birthed something unprecedented. This is the story of Jane Ives, the girl they called 11, a child weapon, a psychic phenomenon, a survivor who would become the bridge between our world and something far darker. Her story begins not in the sterile corridors where she would spend her formative years, but in the mind of her mother, Jane Ives, a young woman who believed she was serving her country. It's the late 1960s, early 1970s, and America was locked in a shadow war with the Soviet Union. But this wasn't a war fought with tanks and missiles alone. This was a war of minds, of psychological weapons, of experiments that pushed the boundaries of human consciousness into territories that should have remained unexplored. Jane Ives volunteered for what she believed was a simple study. The MKUltra program, ostensibly a research project examining the effects of various substances on human cognition, promised modest compensation for her participation. What Terry didn't know, what none of the participants truly understood, was that MKUltra represented something far more sinister. Under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency, scientists were attempting to unlock latent psychic abilities through a combination of hallucinogenic drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation. They were trying to create spies who could infiltrate enemy minds, soldiers who could kill with a thought. Terry was pregnant when she entered the program. The drugs they administered, the experiments they conducted, all of it filtered through her bloodstream to the developing child in her womb. On June 7, 1971, Jane Ives was born, but Terry never got to hold her daughter, never got to hear her first cry. The moment Jane entered the world, Dr. Martin Brenner, the man orchestrating these unholy experiments, recognized what they had inadvertently created. This child showed immediate signs of psychokinetic ability, a power that manifested in ways Brenner had only theorized possible. Within hours of her birth, Jane was torn from her mother's arms. The official story declared the baby stillborn. Terry was left with empty arms and a grief that would eventually shatter her mind when she tried, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to reclaim her stolen child. But Jane wasn't dead. She was being transformed into something else entirely. In the underground facility of Hawkins National Laboratory, Dr. Brenner designated her as Subject 11, the number tattooed onto her wrist like livestock, erasing her birth name, her heritage, her humanity. 11 was one of many, though she would prove to be the most powerful of all Brenner's test subjects. Her childhood, if you could call it that, consisted of clinical examinations, psychological tests, and increasingly dangerous experiments designed to push her abilities to their absolute limits. The laboratory became her entire world. She knew nothing of sunshine, of playing with other children in parks, of bedtime stories or birthday cakes. Her reality consisted of white walls, fluorescent lighting that never truly replicated daylight, and the constant presence of guards and scientists who viewed her not as a child, but as a weapon to be honed. Dr. Brenner, whom she was instructed to call Papa, represented the closest thing to parental affection she would know for years. But his love, such as it was, came with conditions. Perform well in the tests, demonstrate progress in your abilities, and Papa would offer measured praise. Fail, resist, show weakness, and punishment followed swiftly. The other children in the program became her only peers. Numbered like her, these young test subjects shared the same strange existence, though each possessed different manifestations of psychic ability. Some could manipulate visual perception, creating illusions that seemed absolutely real to anyone observing them. Others demonstrated precognitive abilities, catching glimpses of possible futures. But 11's telekinesis proved the most versatile and, in Brenner's estimation, the most valuable for practical application. She could move objects with her mind, sometimes with devastating force. She could reach into other dimensions of consciousness, projecting her awareness across vast distances to spy on targets Brenner designated. They called this projection the void. When 11 entered deep concentration, often facilitated by sensory deprivation in a pool of salt water that mimicked the conditions of the womb, she could access a black, infinite space where distance became meaningless. In the void, she could locate anyone, anywhere, as long as she had some connection to them, some thread of memory or image to follow. She would see them suspended in darkness, could observe them, could even communicate if she concentrated hard enough. This ability made her invaluable to the intelligence operations Brenner ran through the laboratory. Soviet operatives, enemy scientists, targets thousands of miles away, all became accessible through 11's unique gift. But gifts always come with a price. Every time 11 used her abilities, especially when she pushed them to extreme degrees, it cost her. Blood would stream from her nose, sometimes from her ears. Her body would tremble with exhaustion. Headaches would leave her incapacitated for hours. And there was something else. Something darker that Brenner either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. Each time 11 reached into the void, each time she used her powers to harm or destroy, a small piece of her humanity eroded away. The guilt, the horror of what she was being made to do, began building like sediment in her psyche. Among the test subjects, there was one who showed particular interest in 11, an orderly who worked in the facility, a young man who seemed kind, where others were merely clinical. He spoke to her gently, offered encouragement, even defended her when other staff members were cruel. To young 11, desperate for any genuine human connection, this orderly represented something precious. He understood her. He too had suffered under Brenner's regime, or so it seemed. The truth, as 11 would eventually discover to her horror, painted a far more sinister picture. This orderly was actually Henry Creel, designated as Subject 1, the very first of Brenner's psychic experiments. Henry's story stretched back decades before 11's birth, to 1959, when the Creel family moved into a house in Hawkins. Even as a child, Henry possessed abilities that terrified his mother. He could see into the darkness between moments, could sense the malevolent entities that existed just beyond human perception. His father, Victor Creel, a World War II veteran, interpreted the strange events plaguing their home as demonic. But Virginia Creel, Henry's mother, recognized the truth. Her son was the source of the horror. When Virginia attempted to have Henry committed, he made a choice that would echo through decades. Using his powers that even then exceeded anything 11 would initially demonstrate, Henry murdered his mother and sister. He crushed them psychically, broke their bones, removed their eyes in a display of such savage violence that even he fell into a coma from the exertion. Victor Creel, blamed for the murders, was institutionalized, and Dr. Brenner, recognizing Henry's potential, claimed the boy for his experiments. For years, Henry remained at Hawkins Laboratory. But Brenner feared him, recognized that Henry's abilities, if left unchecked, could destroy everything. So Brenner had a device implanted in Henry's body, a chip that suppressed his powers, rendering him essentially human. For years, Henry lived in impotent rage, forced to work as an orderly, forced to watch as Brenner attempted to recreate his abilities in other subjects. And in 11, he saw his successor. Someone potentially even more powerful than himself. So Henry befriended her, spoke to her of freedom, convinced her that together they could escape Brenner's control. And young 11, desperate for connection, desperate to believe someone truly cared for her, trusted him. When Henry asked her to use her powers to remove the suppressing device from his body, claiming it was merely a tracking chip, 11 did so without hesitation. The moment Henry's powers returned, the laboratory became a slaughterhouse. September 8th, 1979. A date that would be seared into Eleven's memory, though for years she would repress the truth of what happened. Henry, his abilities restored, began systematically murdering everyone in the facility. The guards who had watched over him, the scientists who had studied him, and most horrifying of all, the other children. Eleven's brothers and sisters in captivity. He killed them with casual brutality, crushing their bodies, breaking them like discarded toys. 11, hiding in a closet as Henry instructed, heard the screams. When she emerged and witnessed the carnage, when Henry explained what he'd done and invited her to join him in reshaping the world, something fundamental shifted in her understanding. This wasn't liberation. This was genocide. Henry didn't want to free them from Brenner's control. He wanted to annihilate everything, to tear down all structures of civilization and remake existence according to his twisted vision. For the first time in her life, 11 refused. Refused to obey, refused to submit, refused to be the weapon Henry wanted her to be. And when Henry attacked her, attempting to force her cooperation or kill her for her defiance, 11 discovered reserves of power she hadn't known existed. The fight between them was titanic, a psychic duel that literally tore reality apart. At first, Henry seemed overwhelmingly stronger. He'd had years to develop his abilities while she was still a child. But 11 reached for something Henry had long ago abandoned: love. The memory of her birth, the one moment when her mother had held her and whispered words of affection before Brenner stole her away. That memory, that single moment of unconditional love, became 11's anchor. The power that surged through her in that moment exceeded anything Brenner had coaxed from her in years of experimentation. 11 didn't just defeat Henry. She tore open a hole in the fabric of reality itself, banishing him through a gateway into another dimension. Henry, screaming, was flung into the Upside Down, that mirror realm of decay and shadow that existed parallel to our world. Lightning arced across his body as he fell through that impossible space. His flesh burned and twisted, transforming him from human into something monstrous. When Henry finally came to rest in that nightmare dimension, he had become Vecna, a creature of vengeful malevolence who would spend years plotting his return. But 11 didn't know any of this. The trauma of that day, the guilt of having enabled Henry's rampage by removing his suppressor, the horror of watching her fellow test subjects die, all of it proved too much for her young mind to process. So she did what traumatized minds do. She buried the memory, repressed it so thoroughly that she convinced herself she was the one who had killed everyone. This false memory, this self-imposed guilt, would haunt her for years. Dr. Brenner survived the massacre, found 11 unconscious amid the carnage, and reinforced her false belief that she was responsible. Whether he genuinely believed this, or simply found it convenient to make 11 think she was capable of such violence, the result was the same. 11 remained at the laboratory, even more isolated than before, convinced she was a monster barely kept in check. The years that followed were perhaps the loneliest of her existence. Without the other children, without even Henry's false friendship, 11 had only Brenner and the clinical staff. Her powers grew stronger, refined through constant testing, but so did her sense of wrongness. She knew, on some level that transcended conscious thought, that she didn't belong in this sterile prison, that there was a world beyond these walls, a life she was being denied. In November of 1983, everything changed. Brenner ordered 11 to use the void to make contact with a creature his instruments had detected lurking at the edges of perception. This entity, what the children of Hawkins would later call a demogorgon, existed in that shadow realm 11 had inadvertently accessed years before. When Eleven's consciousness touched the creature, it created a bridge. A gateway tore open between dimensions, allowing the Demogorgon to cross into our reality. The creature immediately attacked, and in the chaos that followed, as guards and scientists scrambled to contain the breach, 11 saw her opportunity. She ran. For the first time in her 12 years of life, 11 fled into the world beyond the laboratory. She had no plan, no understanding of how to survive outside those walls. She was dressed in a hospital gown, her head shaved, feet bare, running through woods during a storm. She was terrified and lost, but she was free. That freedom, however precarious, represented her first choice in a life defined by compulsory service. She took refuge in a small restaurant, Benny's Burgers, where the proprietor, Benny Hammond, found her shivering and starving in his back room. Benny, a kind man with a protective instinct, tried to help her, gave her food, warm clothes, treated her with a gentleness she'd rarely experienced. But Brenner's people were hunting her, and anyone who aided her became a target. When Benny called social services, attempting to find proper help for this clearly troubled child, Brenner's agents intercepted the call. They arrived pretending to be social workers, and when Benny realized something was wrong, they killed him, made it look like suicide. 11, hiding, watched the man who'd shown her kindness die because of his association with her. She fled again, running through the rain, and fate or coincidence brought her to another group of people who would change everything. 3 boys, Mike Wheeler, Dustin Henderson, and Lucas Sinclair, were searching the woods for their missing friend, Will Byers. They'd been riding their bikes through the storm when they found her, soaked and terrified, standing in the middle of the road. Mike, displaying the leadership and compassion that would define him, made an immediate decision. This girl needed help, and he would provide it, even if it meant hiding her from his parents. He brought 11 to his house, smuggled her into the basement, and began trying to understand who she was and where she'd come from. The other boys were skeptical. Lucas, the most pragmatic of the group, wanted to inform the authorities. Dustin was fascinated but cautious. But Mike saw past 11's strangeness, past her minimal vocabulary and odd behavior. He saw a person who needed protection. Over the following days, as the boys questioned 11 about Will's disappearance, she revealed glimpses of her abilities. She recognized Will from a photograph, said she'd seen him in the void. The boys, steeped in their Dungeons and Dragons terminology, began to understand that 11 possessed actual psychic powers. More than that, she seemed to know something about where Will had gone. She could help find him if they trusted her. Trust, however, didn't come easily. 11 had been instructed by Brenner to view the world outside the laboratory as dangerous, full of threats to be neutralized. Her conditioning made genuine connection difficult, and she was hiding a terrible secret from the boys. In her initial contact with the Demogorgon, when she'd opened that gateway, she'd effectively unleashed the creature that took Will. The guilt of this knowledge, even if the action wasn't truly her fault, weighed on her. Lucas remained suspicious, and tensions within the group escalated. When he and Mike argued about whether to trust 11, she used her powers to make Lucas fall from his bike, injuring him. This display of casual violence shocked the boys, reinforcing Lucas's belief that she was dangerous. But Mike defended her, and in that defense, something deeper began to develop between them. Mike was the first person outside of the laboratory to treat 11 as human rather than weapon. He gave her a new name, Elle, a shortening of 11 that felt more personal, more like an actual identity than a designation number. He showed her his toys, tried to make her laugh, shared his food with her. For 11, these interactions represented a revelation. There were people who could care without demanding obedience, who saw value in her beyond her abilities. Mike explained friendship to her, though she didn't initially understand the concept. "What is friend?" she'd asked, and Mike's attempts to articulate something so fundamental, yet so intangible, illustrated the vast gulf between her experience and normal childhood. As the search for Will intensified, 11 used her powers to help locate him. In Mike's basement, using a Dungeons & Dragons board as a map and a radio for amplification, she demonstrated that Will was alive but trapped in some dark, cold place. The Upside Down, though they didn't yet have a name for it. Will was hiding from the creature 11 had inadvertently unleashed, barely surviving in a dimension where decay and predation ruled. The boys' belief in 11's information wasn't universal. The adults in their lives, particularly Police Chief Jim Hopper and Joyce Byers, Will's mother, were pursuing their own investigations. But as the evidence mounted, as strange events proliferated throughout Hawkins, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. The boundaries between dimensions were breaking down, and at the center of it all was this strange girl with psychic powers. 11's presence in Mike's house couldn't remain secret indefinitely. When she was discovered, Mike's parents reacted with understandable shock. But before explanations could be offered, before any semblance of normalcy could be established, Brenner's agents descended on the Wheeler residence. They'd been systematically searching Hawkins, closing in on 11's location. The boys barely escaped with 11, fleeing as government vehicles surrounded the house. The ensuing chase was harrowing. Lucas, having reconciled with the group, rejoined them as they fled toward a junkyard. When a convoy of government vehicles caught up to them, 11 demonstrated the full extent of her abilities. She flipped a van through the air with a thought, sending it careening over their heads to block their pursuers. The boys watched in stunned amazement and fear as this 12-year-old girl wielded power that defied comprehension. They were joined by Hopper, Joyce, Nancy Wheeler, and Jonathan Byers. This disparate group, united by their connection to Will's disappearance, began to understand that they were facing something far beyond normal experience. 11, though exhausted and frightened, agreed to help them. They needed to find the gate to the Upside Down, seal it, and rescue Will before the Demogorgon killed him. To locate Will precisely, they constructed a makeshift sensory deprivation tank. In a middle school gymnasium, they filled a kiddie pool with water and enough salt to allow 11 to float, then covered her eyes. In that artificial void, 11 projected her consciousness into the Upside Down. She found Will, weak and barely conscious, hiding in a constructed fort in that nightmare dimension. But she also found Barb Holland, Nancy's friend who had disappeared the same night as Will. Barb was gone, dead, consumed by the dimension's horrors. The confirmation that Barb was dead, delivered in 11's halting speech, devastated Nancy. But it also confirmed what they'd suspected. The Upside Down was actively hostile, a place of death and decay where human life couldn't long survive. If they didn't act quickly, Will would suffer the same fate. As they planned their rescue, Mike made 11 a promise. Once they'd defeated the bad men and the monster, once everything was over, she would come live with his family. His mother would take care of her. She would have a real home, a real life. Mike fumbled his explanation, trying to articulate feelings he was only beginning to understand himself, and then he kissed her. It was a child's kiss, innocent and brief, but it meant everything to 11. Someone wanted her, not for her powers, not as a weapon, but as a person, as family. They went to Hawkins Middle School to confront the Demogorgon. Brenner's agents arrived simultaneously, still hunting 11. When Connie Fraser, one of Brenner's most loyal operatives, cornered the group, 11 had a choice. She could surrender, return to the laboratory and its clinical prison, or she could fight. She chose to fight. With brutal efficiency, she killed multiple agents, crushing them with focused, psychokinetic force. Each death cost her, blood streaming from her nose, but she protected her friends with absolute determination. Then the Demogorgon arrived. The creature, drawn by the concentration of blood and fear, broke through into the school. It was massive, a predator perfectly adapted to its nightmare dimension. Brenner attempted to contain it, but the Demogorgon killed his agents with mechanical efficiency. In the chaos, 11 was separated from the boys. She made her way to a classroom, exhausted, her powers nearly spent. Mike found her there, told her again about the snowball, the school dance he'd promised to take her to. It was a promise of normalcy, of a future beyond this horror. But the Demogorgon broke through the ceiling before they could escape. It advanced on them, and 11 knew what she had to do. She'd opened the gate that let this creature through. It was her responsibility to close it. Mike begged her not to fight it. He could see how drained she was, could see that using her powers any further might kill her. But 11 pushed him away gently. "Friends don't lie," she told him, echoing his own words back to him. Then she turned to face the Demogorgon. The confrontation was apocalyptic. 11 channeled every remaining fragment of her power into the attack. She didn't just kill the creature. She disintegrated it, burned it away at a molecular level. But the effort consumed her as well. As the Demogorgon dissolved, so did 11, both of them vanishing in a cascade of dissolving particles. The boys watched in horror as their friend simply ceased to exist in front of them. Mike screamed her name, searched frantically through the empty classroom, but there was no trace of 11. She was gone, seemingly sacrificed to save them all. The boys were left to process the trauma of everything they'd witnessed, everything they'd survived. Will was rescued from the Upside Down, pulled back from the brink of death, but 11's fate remained unknown. For Mike, her loss was devastating. He'd opened himself emotionally for the first time, had found a connection that transcended his other friendships, and she'd been taken from him. Every night, for 353 nights, Mike tried to contact 11 through his radio. He'd sit in his basement, in the blanket fort they'd built together, and broadcast messages into the static, hoping she could hear him, hoping she was still alive somewhere. What Mike didn't know was that 11 had survived. She hadn't been disintegrated, but rather transported. When she destroyed the Demogorgon, she'd been pulled into the Upside Down itself. She woke in that nightmare dimension, alone and terrified, but her powers had been sufficient to tear open an exit. She emerged back in Hawkins, specifically at the middle school, but by then everyone was gone. The government was still hunting her, and she couldn't risk revealing herself to anyone. So 11 went into hiding. She lived in the woods like a feral child, hunting small animals for food, avoiding all human contact. She was surviving but not living, haunted by loneliness and the desire to reach out to Mike. She could hear his nightly broadcasts, could use the void to watch him calling to her, but she didn't know how to respond without putting him in danger. Then Hopper found her. More accurately, 11 found the boxes of food Hopper had been leaving in the woods, including Eggo waffles, which had become her comfort food during her brief time with Mike. She tracked Hopper to his grandfather's old cabin, hidden deep in the forest. Hopper, who had lost his own daughter Sarah to cancer years before, saw in 11 an opportunity to be the father he'd been denied the chance to be. He offered 11 a deal. She could live in the cabin, hidden from the government and safe from discovery, but she had to stay out of sight. No going into town, no making contact with anyone, especially not Mike. It was for her own protection, Hopper insisted. The government was still searching for her, and if they discovered she was alive, they would reclaim her. For almost a year, 11 lived in that cabin. Hopper became her guardian, though their relationship was often contentious. He was gruff and overprotective, enforcing rules that felt suffocating to someone who'd already spent her childhood imprisoned. He taught her vocabulary, expanding her linguistic abilities far beyond the rudimentary speech she'd possessed when they met. He brought her books, old television shows to watch, attempted to give her some approximation of a normal childhood within the severe constraints of their situation. But 11 chafed under these restrictions. She could hear Mike calling to her every night. She could use the void to watch him, could see his grief, his refusal to give up on her, and she couldn't respond, couldn't let him know she was alive and safe. The frustration built until she couldn't contain it anymore. 11 and Hopper fought. She accused him of being like Papa, of keeping her imprisoned for his own purposes rather than her safety. Hopper, hurt and angry, tried to explain the genuine danger she faced, but 11 wasn't listening. In a moment of rebellion, she left the cabin while Hopper was away. She ventured into town, made her way to Mike's school. She saw him through the gymnasium windows, and her heart soared. But then, she saw Max Mayfield, a new girl who had joined the boys' group, standing close to Mike. 11, who'd never experienced jealousy before, felt it flare through her with volcanic intensity. She used her powers to knock Max off her skateboard, then fled before Mike could see her. This incident revealed something important about 11's development. She was becoming more emotionally complex, experiencing feelings beyond the narrow range Brenner had permitted. Jealousy, possessiveness, insecurity, all the messy emotions of adolescence were emerging. She was human, not a weapon, and her emotions demanded expression. Back at the cabin, 11 searched through Hopper's belongings and found a box containing information about her past. Photographs, documents, including her mother's name and location. Terry Ives, her real mother, who Brenner had told her was dead. The revelation that Terry was alive sent 11 on a journey of discovery that Hopper hadn't authorized. She found Terry in her sister's house, and what she discovered broke her heart in new ways. Terry was alive, but shattered. The repeated attempts to break into Hawkins Laboratory and reclaim her daughter, the electroshock therapy administered to suppress her delusions, all of it had fractured Terry's mind. She existed in a catatonic loop, reliving the same fragmentary memories over and over. 11, using her powers, could enter her mother's consciousness and see the truth of her birth, the kidnapping, Terry's desperate attempts to save her. But Terry couldn't truly connect with her daughter. The damage was irreversible. 11 wept in her mother's arms, but Terry didn't recognize her, couldn't escape her mental prison. It was a reunion that offered no closure, only a deeper understanding of everything that had been stolen from them both. From Terry's sister Becky, 11 learned about another test subject from Brenner's program. Kaylee, designated as number 8, had escaped years ago and was rumored to be in Chicago. 11, desperate for connection with someone who shared her experience, who could understand her in ways no one else could, tracked Carly down. Carly led a gang of outcasts, using her unique ability to create illusions for revenge killings against people who'd wronged them. She'd been searching for 11, knowing that together their combined powers could be unstoppable. Kaylee tried to teach 11 to embrace her anger, to use her rage as fuel for her abilities. It was a seductive philosophy for someone who'd been hurt as deeply as 11. Kaylee's gang planned to kill Ray Carroll, a former Hawkins Laboratory employee who'd assisted in the abuses 11 suffered. When they confronted him, 11 came face to face with her capacity for vengeance. But when she saw that Ray had children, daughters looking at her with the same fear she'd felt countless times, 11 couldn't go through with the execution. She wasn't like Kaylee, wasn't interested in revenge. She'd hurt people, yes, but always in self-defense or defense of others. She wouldn't become the monster Brenner had tried to create. She left Carly and returned to Hawkins, arriving just as a new crisis emerged. The Mind Flayer, that vast shadow entity that ruled the Upside Down, had possessed Will Byers. It was using him as a spy, learning about Hawkins, planning an invasion. The boys needed Eleven's help, and despite Hopper's concerns, she revealed herself to them. The reunion between Eleven and Mike was everything both had dreamed of for months. Mike was initially angry at Hopper for hiding her, but that anger dissolved the moment he could hold her again. They'd both changed, grown, but the connection between them remained. At the Snowball, the school dance Mike had promised to take her to a year before, they slow danced together. It was the ordinary moment of adolescent romance they'd been denied, made precious by everything they'd endured to reach it, but normalcy remained elusive. By the summer of 1985, Eleven and Mike's relationship had progressed to typical teenage territory. They spent vast amounts of time together, much to Hopper's increasing irritation. Hopper, uncomfortable with his adopted daughter's emerging sexuality and romantic attachment, attempted to intervene. His clumsy, overprotective efforts created friction that pushed Eleven toward a different kind of connection. Max Mayfield, the girl Eleven had once viewed with jealousy, became a genuine friend. Max introduced Eleven to aspects of teenage life she'd never experienced. Shopping at the mall, trying different clothes and styles, talking about boys, experimenting with her appearance. Eleven discovered that she could be more than the person others expected her to be. She could make choices about her identity, her presentation, her interests. This period of relative peace shattered when the Mind Flayer returned. The creature had never truly left after possessing Will. A fragment of it remained, waiting for an opportunity. When Soviet scientists beneath the Starcourt Mall forced open a new gate to the Upside Down, the Mind Flayer reconstituted itself. It began possessing the citizens of Hawkins, creating an army of the flayed, people whose bodies and minds it controlled completely. Billy Hargrove, Max's stepbrother, became the Mind Flayer's primary host. Through Billy, the creature orchestrated the collection of materials it needed to create a physical form, a massive body composed of melted human remains. It was targeting Eleven specifically, wanting to eliminate the only person who could truly threaten its plans for domination. The conflict climaxed at Starcourt Mall. The Mind Flayer attacked, and in defending her friends, Eleven was injured. One of the creature's tentacles pierced her leg, and worse, embedded a fragment of itself inside her. The injury not only caused physical damage, but seemed to disrupt Eleven's abilities. She tried using her powers and found them diminished, unreliable. Billy, still possessed but retaining some fragment of his own consciousness, captured Eleven and brought her to the Mind Flayer. The creature prepared to consume her, to eliminate its greatest threat. But Eleven reached Billy with words, reminding him of his mother, of the person he'd been before his abusive father had twisted him. In a moment of redemption, Billy threw himself between Eleven and the Mind Flayer, allowing the creature to kill him instead, giving the others time to close the gate and sever the Mind Flayer's connection to our world. They succeeded in stopping the invasion, but at tremendous cost. Billy was dead. Hopper was apparently killed in the destruction of the Soviet facility beneath the mall, and Eleven's powers were gone. Whether the injury from the Mind Flayer had permanently damaged her abilities, or whether the trauma of everything she'd experienced had created a psychological block, Eleven could no longer access the gifts that had defined her existence. Without her powers, without Hopper, Eleven felt hollowed out. The Byers family took her in, and 3 months later, they all moved away from Hawkins. Joyce couldn't remain in the town that had taken so much from her family. Mike and Eleven shared a tearful goodbye, promising to visit each other, declaring their love in that desperate way of teenagers who believe distance will destroy everything. In California, 11 tried to build a normal life. She attended Lenora Hills High School as Jane Hopper, Hopper's legal name for her. But normalcy proved impossible. She was bullied relentlessly, her awkward social skills and odd background making her a target. She struggled to make friends, to understand the casual cruelties of teenage social hierarchies. She missed Mike, missed her powers, missed the sense of purpose that had driven her for so long. When a federal agent approached her during Mike's spring break visit, offering to restore her abilities through a new program called Nina, 11 initially refused. She'd begun to wonder if maybe she could be happy as just a normal girl. But when she learned that a new evil threatened Hawkins, that her friends were in danger, she made the choice she'd always made. She would help, no matter the cost to herself. The Nina Project, conducted in a hidden facility in the Nevada desert, required 11 to confront her most suppressed memories. Dr. Owens and, shockingly, Dr. Brenner, who had somehow survived the Demogorgon attack in 1983, explained that her powers hadn't truly left. They'd been locked away, buried beneath trauma. To access them again, she needed to relive the worst day of her life: the massacre at Hawkins Laboratory. Through Nina's sensory deprivation system, 11 was forced to experience her memories from 1979. She relived her friendship with the orderly, the moment she removed his suppressor, the horror of discovering what he'd done. But she also recovered the truth she'd repressed. She wasn't responsible for the massacre. Henry Creel, number 1, had committed those murders, and she'd stopped him, banished him to the Upside Down, where he'd transformed into Vecna. This revelation, this reclamation of truth, restored more than her powers. It restored her understanding of herself. She wasn't a monster. She'd never been the killer she'd believed herself to be. Her actions had been protective, defensive, heroic even. The guilt that had haunted her for years dissolved, and with it, the psychological barrier keeping her powers locked away. 11 escaped the Nina facility when it was attacked by military forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, who believed 11 was responsible for the recent murders in Hawkins. With help from Mike, Will, Jonathan, and their allies, she made her way to a pizza parlor equipped with enough salt to create a makeshift sensory deprivation tank. Back in Hawkins, Vecna was systematically murdering teenagers, targeting those carrying trauma and guilt. Max Mayfield had become his intended 4th victim, the final sacrifice he needed to tear open gates throughout Hawkins and merge the Upside Down with our world completely. Vecna wasn't just killing for sport. Each murder created a fracture between dimensions, and 4 deaths would shatter the barrier entirely. 11, from across the country, entered the void through her improvised tank. She projected her consciousness into the Upside Down, searching for Max. What she found was a nightmare battlefield. Vecna, that twisted amalgamation of Henry Creel's malice and the Upside Down's corruption, had Max trapped in his mindscape. He was slowly killing her, breaking her limbs one by one, removing her eyes in the same manner he'd killed his own family decades before. The psychic confrontation between 11 and Vecna represented a clash of philosophies as much as powers. Vecna believed that humanity was a plague, that people were inherently cruel and deserving of extinction. He saw himself as a spider and humans as trapped flies, existing only to be consumed. His years in the Upside Down, connected to the Mind Flayer, serving as its general in a war against our dimension, had only reinforced this misanthropic worldview. 11 countered with a simple truth. She'd seen the worst of humanity, had been tortured and exploited from birth, had every reason to agree with Vecna's assessment. But she'd also experienced love, friendship, sacrifice, Mike teaching her what friendship meant, Hopper becoming the father she'd been denied, Max showing her how to be more than what others expected. These connections, these moments of genuine human compassion, proved that humanity was worth saving. The battle was brutal. Vecna, with years of accumulated power and the Mind Flayer's cosmic malevolence behind him, seemed unstoppable. He overpowered 11 repeatedly, throwing her consciousness across mindscapes, trying to break her as he'd broken so many others. But 11 had something Vecna had abandoned long ago. She had people she was fighting for, people whose lives gave her strength. In the physical world, Mike held 11's actual body, whispering to her even though she couldn't hear him in any conventional sense. He told her he loved her, that he'd always loved her, from the moment she'd entered his basement in her hospital gown and said the word no when he'd asked if she wanted to be his friend. He told her she was a superhero, not because of her powers, but because of her heart, her courage, her refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Somehow, across the distance and dimensions, 11 heard him. Or perhaps she simply felt the truth of his words resonating through their connection. She found the strength to push back against Vecna, to match his power with her own. But it wasn't enough. Vecna was too strong, too deeply rooted in the Upside Down's architecture. She couldn't kill him. What she could do was save Max. As Vecna prepared to complete his ritual, to use Max's death as the final key to open his gates, 11 did something she'd never attempted before. She didn't just observe through the void. She manifested there, projected her physical form through sheer force of will. She appeared beside Max's broken body and tore her away from Vecna's grasp. Max's heart had stopped. Technically, she was dead, Vecna's fourth victim. But 11 refused to accept that finality. She cradled Max's body and reached into her chest, not physically but psychically, and restarted her heart through pure determination. She literally pulled Max back from death, demonstrating a level of power that surpassed anything she'd previously accomplished. But the strain was immense. While 11 battled Vecna in the psychic realm, Steve Harrington, Nancy Wheeler, and Robin Buckley confronted his physical body in the upside-down version of the Creel house. They attacked with Molotov cocktails and gunfire, burning and shooting Vecna, while he was distracted by his fight with 11. The combined assault, from both the physical and psychic fronts, proved too much even for him. Vecna's body fell from the window of the Creel house, plummeting into the dead earth of the Upside Down. But he didn't die. When Steve approached to confirm the kill, the body was gone, crawled away to heal and plot revenge. And despite 11's heroic intervention, despite saving Max's life, she hadn't stopped Vecna from completing his ritual. 4 gates tore open across Hawkins, spreading from the 4 murder sites, carving massive wounds through the town. The Upside Down began bleeding into Hawkins. Strange spores filled the air. Vines and decay spread across familiar streets. The barrier between dimensions, already weakened by years of interference, was finally shattering. Hawkins was becoming a battleground, the intersection point where 2 realities collided. Max survived but remained in a coma, her consciousness trapped somewhere 11 couldn't reach. When 11 tried to find Max in the void, searching for her friend's presence, she found only emptiness. Max's mind, her memories, her personality, everything that made her Max, was simply gone. It was as if Vecna had taken that part of her when she died, even if her body still breathed. This particular loss haunted 11 in ways different from her other failures. She'd saved Max's life, but couldn't save her mind. It represented the limitations of even her extraordinary abilities. A reminder that some damage couldn't be undone, some losses couldn't be recovered. 2 days after Vecna's assault, 11 returned to Hawkins. The town was evacuated, families fleeing the inexplicable destruction that had torn through their community. But Mike and the others remained, setting up a relief center to help those who had nowhere else to go. When 11 walked into that gymnasium and saw Mike, their reunion was quieter than the previous one, marked by exhaustion and trauma rather than joy. But there was also determination. Hopper had returned from the Soviet prison where he'd been held for months, reuniting with 11 in an embrace that spoke to the father-daughter bond they'd forged. Joyce had brought him home, and together this makeshift family stood ready to face whatever came next. Because Vecna wasn't finished, the gates remained open. The upside down continued spreading. And somewhere in that nightmare dimension, wounded but alive, Henry Creel was planning his final assault. He'd failed to kill 11, failed to merge the dimensions completely, but he'd wounded Hawkins deeply enough that finishing the job might be inevitable. 11 stood at the edge of one of the massive gates, staring into the hellscape beyond. Mike joined her, taking her hand. They didn't need to speak. They both understood what was coming. One final battle. One last confrontation between 11 and the monster wearing Henry Creel's hatred. The story of 11 is fundamentally a story about identity and choice. Born as Jane Ives, transformed into Subject 11, she spent years trying to understand who she was beyond the designation tattooed on her wrist. Every relationship she formed, every choice she made, every time she used her powers for protection rather than destruction, she was answering that question. She was defining herself not by what others made her, but by what she chose to be. Her powers, those extraordinary psychokinetic abilities that made her valuable to Brenner and terrifying to her enemies, were never the most important thing about her. They were tools, capabilities she could use for good or ill. What mattered was her heart, her capacity for love and loyalty, despite years of abuse and exploitation. She'd been raised as a weapon, trained to kill without question, conditioned to obey, and she'd rejected all of it the moment she encountered genuine human connection. Mike Wheeler represented her first experience with unconditional acceptance. He didn't want her for her powers, though he appreciated them. He didn't need her to be anything other than herself. When he promised her that his mother would take care of her, that she could have a normal life, he was offering her something more valuable than safety. He was offering her belonging, a place in the world that wasn't contingent on her usefulness. Hopper became the father figure she desperately needed. His overprotectiveness, though sometimes frustrating, came from genuine love rather than desire to control. When he adopted her legally, giving her his name, he was telling her that she was his daughter, not because of shared genetics, but because of shared experience and mutual care. He'd lost Sarah, and grief had nearly destroyed him. 11 gave him a second chance at fatherhood, and he gave her the stability and structure that allowed her to begin healing from her trauma. Max taught her that female friendship could be powerful and enriching. Before Max, 11's only female relationships had been with Terry, who couldn't truly connect with her, and Kaylee, who'd wanted to channel 11's anger for revenge. Max showed her that girls could support each other, could be allies rather than competitors. Through Max, 11 learned about fashion and music and the ordinary pleasures of teenage life. And when Max was threatened, 11 fought with the ferocity of someone defending family. The relationship between 11 and Vecna, between Subject 11 and Subject 1, forms a dark mirror reflection. Both were children taken and transformed by Brenner's experiments. Both possessed powers that exceeded normal human capability. Both suffered abuse and isolation. But their responses to that trauma diverged completely. Henry Creel chose misanthropy and destruction. He decided that if he had to suffer, then everyone should suffer. His pain became weaponized, transformed into a crusade against humanity itself. 11 chose differently. She absorbed her pain, processed it, and ultimately decided that the love she'd experienced, however brief and imperfect, was more real than the cruelty. She could have become like Henry. The potential for that darkness existed in her. We saw glimpses of it when she used her powers in anger, when she hurt Lucas out of jealousy, when she nearly killed the laboratory employees who'd assisted in her abuse. But every time, she pulled back from that edge. Every time, she chose connection over isolation, protection over destruction. This choice didn't make her weak. If anything, it made her stronger. When she faced Vecna in that final confrontation, she matched his power not through equivalent hatred, but through love. Love for Mike, for Hopper, for Max and the others. That love became her armor and her weapon, proof that Henry's philosophy was fundamentally wrong. Humans weren't inherently cruel. They were capable of both cruelty and compassion, and the choice between those paths defined everything. The loss of Eleven's powers between seasons 3 and 4 served a crucial narrative purpose. It forced her to exist without the abilities that had defined her since birth. For the first time, she had to navigate life as just a girl, without the safety net of psychokinesis to fall back on. And she discovered that being powerless made her vulnerable in ways she'd never experienced. The bullies at her new school tormented her precisely because she couldn't defend herself the way she once might have. But that period also taught her something essential. Her value as a person wasn't contingent on her abilities. Mike loved her with or without powers. Hopper had adopted her, knowing she might never access those abilities again. The Byers family welcomed her into their home as just Jane, a troubled teenager who needed support and understanding. Her powers were part of her, yes, but they weren't the totality of her identity. When her abilities returned, 11 had a more mature understanding of what they meant and how to use them. She wasn't the weapon Brenner had created or the avenging angel Kaylee had wanted her to become. She was a protector, someone who used extraordinary capabilities in service of ordinary people who couldn't defend themselves. She was a superhero in the truest sense, defined not by her powers, but by her commitment to helping others. The trauma 11 carries is multi-layered and profound. The abuse at Hawkins Laboratory, the guilt over the massacre she thought she'd committed, the loss of her mother to mental illness, watching Hopper apparently die, seeing Max reduced to an empty shell. Any one of these experiences would be sufficient to break most people. But 11 continues fighting, continues hoping, because she's seen that change is possible, that healing can occur, that even the darkest situations can be survived. Her journey with understanding language and communication mirrors her larger journey toward humanity. In the beginning, her vocabulary was minimal, restricted to essential words and phrases. Papa, bad, promise. The expansion of her linguistic ability represented her expanding understanding of the world and her place in it. When she told Mike that friends don't lie, she was articulating a philosophy she'd learned from him. When she told Hopper that he'd made her feel like she wasn't a mistake, she was expressing an emotional complexity she'd developed through their relationship. By the time we reach season 4, 11 can articulate her feelings with reasonable sophistication. She writes letters to Mike, though she struggles with spelling and grammar. She can argue with Hopper about rules and fairness. She can comfort Max and joke with the other kids. Language became the bridge that connected her isolated childhood to her emerging adolescence, proof that she was becoming more fully human with each passing day. The visual evolution of 11 is equally significant. When we first meet her, she's bald, dressed in a hospital gown, blank and terrified. Mike gives her a wig and his sister's dress, the first time she's worn anything resembling normal clothes. As the series progresses, we see her experiment with different styles, different presentations of self. The punk look Carly gives her, the colourful mall fashion Max introduces her to, the California girl aesthetic she adopts in season 4. Each change represents her growing understanding that she gets to choose how the world sees her. That identity is something she can shape rather than something imposed upon her. The significance of the name 11 versus Jane versus Elle cannot be overstated. 11 was Brenner's designation, reducing her to a number in a series of experiments. Jane was her birth name, the identity stolen from her, representing the normal life she could have had if Brenner hadn't interfered. Elle was Mike's gift, a nickname that acknowledged her past while creating something new and personal. When Hopper legally adopted her as Jane Hopper, he was giving her a legitimate identity in the world, a way to exist that wasn't contingent on hiding or lying. But in moments of crisis, when she needs to access her full power, she returns to thinking of herself as 11. It's as if that designation, despite all its negative associations, connects her to the deepest wells of her ability. The name carries the weight of everything she's survived, every trial Brenner put her through, every moment she pushed her powers beyond their limits. She's reclaiming it, transforming it from a designation of objectification into a badge of survival. The relationships 11 has built become her true superpower, more valuable than any psychic ability. When she faces Vecna in their climactic battle, what gives her strength isn't just her restored telekinesis, but Mike's words of love and encouragement. When she brings Max back from death, it's not just power, but profound emotional connection that allows her to accomplish the impossible. When she stands ready to face whatever comes next at the gates tearing through Hawkins, she doesn't stand alone but surrounded by people who've chosen to fight beside her. This emphasis on connection, as essential to heroism, offers an important counterpoint to individualistic hero narratives, where lone protagonists save the day through personal prowess alone. 11 is powerful individually, but her greatest victories come through cooperation, through the strength she draws from caring and being cared for. It's a more mature and realistic model of heroism, acknowledging that even the strongest among us need support, that community matters, that we're strongest together rather than apart. The found family that coalesces around 11, Mike and Hopper, and Joyce and Max and all the others, represents chosen kinship that transcends traditional family structures. They're not related by blood, and their connections aren't legally recognized in most cases. But they're bound by shared experience and mutual care in ways that make them family in all the ways that matter. They show up for each other. They risk themselves for each other. They celebrate together and grieve together and face impossible odds together. This model of family as chosen rather than assigned offers hope to viewers whose biological families may be abusive, neglectful, or simply absent. It suggests that family can be found, that belonging can be created, that you're not forever defined by the circumstances of your birth or the family you were born into. You can build your own family from people who see you and value you and choose to stand beside you. For young viewers struggling with difficult home situations, this message can be profoundly meaningful. The legacy 11 leaves, regardless of how her story concludes, extends beyond the narrative of Stranger Things itself. She's become a cultural touchstone, a character whose image and catchphrases have entered popular consciousness. The simple word, friends, spoken in her halting early speech patterns, has become instantly recognizable. The image of her bloody nose has become synonymous with psychic exertion. The ego waffle has become associated with her character to the point where the brand itself has embraced the connection. But more significantly, 11 has become a character young viewers, particularly young women, can see themselves in. She's powerful without being invulnerable. She's damaged without being defined solely by her trauma. She's capable of tremendous violence, but also tremendous compassion. She struggles with the same questions of identity and belonging that adolescents everywhere grapple with, just amplified to fantastical extremes. The representation of a young woman whose strength isn't dependent on physical combat skills or weapons, but on inherent supernatural ability, offers a different kind of power fantasy than traditionally masculine action heroes provide. Eleven doesn't need to train in martial arts or build muscles or acquire arsenals. Her power is intrinsic, part of who she is. This representation matters for viewers who might not see themselves in more traditional action heroes, offering a different model of what strength can look like. At the same time, the show is careful not to make Eleven's powers come without cost or consequence. She's not infinitely powerful or able to solve every problem with a thought. Her abilities have clear limitations, drain her physically, and don't provide solutions to emotional or social challenges. This balance prevents her from becoming a convenient plot device while still allowing her to be genuinely powerful when her capabilities are relevant to the threat at hand. The question of what happens next for Eleven remains open as the show approaches its final season. Vecna is wounded but alive. The gates are open and spreading. Hawkins is becoming a battlefield between dimensions. And Eleven, despite her restored powers, despite her determination, has failed to stop the invasion she inadvertently began years ago. The weight of that failure will shape whatever comes next. But if Eleven's story teaches us anything, it's that failure isn't final. She's been knocked down, repeatedly has lost battles and loved ones, has failed to protect people she cared about, and every time she's gotten back up. Not because she's unfailingly optimistic, or because she doesn't feel the pain of those losses, but because giving up means letting the darkness win, means allowing Vecna's misanthropic philosophy to be proven correct. Eleven fights because she's seen proof that humanity is worth saving. Mike's loyalty, Hopper's sacrifice, Max's friendship, even Lucas and Dustin and the others who've stood beside her knowing they're vastly outmatched in any psychic confrontation. These ordinary people, with their ordinary courage, demonstrate that humanity's strength isn't in supernatural abilities but in our capacity for connection and mutual support. When Eleven stands at the edge of those gates, looking into the Upside Down's decay and horror, she's not just seeing an enemy dimension, she's seeing everything she's fought against, all the darkness and isolation and despair that characterized her childhood in the laboratory. The Upside Down is a physical manifestation of the mindset that created places like Hawkins Laboratory, that reduced children to numbered test subjects, that valued power over humanity, and she rejects it, refuses to let it spread, refuses to let it consume the world where she's finally found belonging. The final battle, whenever it comes, won't just be about closing gates or killing Vecna. It'll be about proving that connection is stronger than isolation, that love is more powerful than hatred, that the girl they designated as 11 has become Jane Hopper, and Jane Hopper chooses humanity. As we reach the end of this exploration, I want to return to where we began, to that moment in November 1983, when a terrified 12-year-old girl in a hospital gown ran through the rain and encountered 3 boys on bikes who would change her life forever. Everything that followed, all the battles and losses and growth and love, all of it stems from that initial moment of connection when Mike Wheeler looked at this strange girl and decided to help her. That choice, to extend compassion to someone who seemed different and potentially dangerous, represents the best of what humanity can be. And Eleven's response, learning to trust despite every reason not to, learning to love despite years of abuse, learning to hope despite repeated loss, represents the resilience that allows individuals to survive and even thrive after trauma. Her story isn't finished yet. The final season will determine how Eleven's journey concludes, whether she finds the peace and normalcy she sought, or whether her path leads to sacrifice and tragedy. But regardless of how the specific narrative resolves, the themes her story explores will continue resonating. The questions her character asks about identity and worth and connection and resilience, these remain relevant long after any particular plot concludes. The name Jane Hopper, her legal identity, represents the person she's becoming. Jane, her birth name, connects her to her mother and her biological origins. Hopper connects her to her chosen father and the family she's built. Together, they represent a complete identity that acknowledges both where she came from and where she's going. She's no longer just 11, the designation that reduced her to a number. She's Jane Hopper, a person with history and relationships and a future, but she'll always be 11 to her friends, to viewers, to herself, in moments when she needs to access the full extent of her abilities. The name carries power because it carries memory, all the pain and struggle and growth that got her from that laboratory to where she is now. She's reclaimed it, transformed it, from a designation of objectification into a name she owns and defines, rather than one that defines her. This reclamation of identity, this transformation of what was meant to dehumanize into something that empowers, represents perhaps the ultimate victory in Eleven's story. Brenner tried to make her into a weapon without personhood, a numbered tool for his purposes, and she became a person who happens to have powers, who uses those abilities according to her own moral compass for causes she chooses. She took everything Brenner tried to make her and transformed it into something he never intended and couldn't control. That's the real superpower, not telekinesis or accessing the void or any of the supernatural abilities. The real superpower is choosing who you are in the face of everyone trying to tell you what you should be. It's maintaining your humanity when circumstances strip away everything that usually defines human existence. It's continuing to care and hope and fight when every rational assessment suggests giving up. 11 does all of this. She chooses heroism over villainy, connection over isolation, hope over despair. She does it imperfectly, with setbacks and failures and moments of doubt. But she keeps choosing, keeps fighting, keeps trying to build a life worth living. And in that persistence, that refusal to surrender to the darkness that's haunted her since birth, she becomes exactly what Mike called her from the beginning. A superhero. Not because of what she can do with her powers, but because of who she chooses to be with her heart. 11's story is about trauma and resilience, about isolation and connection, about being made into a weapon and choosing to be a hero instead. Those themes matter whether you're fighting demogorgons or just trying to survive high school, whether you have psychic powers or just the ordinary courage it takes to be vulnerable and honest and hopeful in a world that often seems designed to crush such qualities. She learned that no matter how dark things get, no matter how isolated or powerless or afraid you feel, you're not alone. You never have to be alone if you're willing to let people in, if you're brave enough to be vulnerable, if you choose connection over the safer but lonelier path of isolation. That's why her story matters. That's why it resonates. That's why, years from now, people will still be talking about the girl with the shaved head and the bloody nose who looked at an impossible situation and said no, who chose to be more than what others made her, who became, against all odds and despite every obstacle, exactly who she was always meant to be. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me through 11's story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of science fiction's most compelling characters, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Star Lore for more explorations into the lore, characters, and hidden depths of your favorite sci-fi and fantasy universes. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of 11's character resonates most with you, or what other Stranger Things lore you'd like us to explore next. And if you really want to support the channel, share this video with someone who loves Stranger Things as much as we do. The algorithm loves it when you do that, and it helps us keep bringing you these comprehensive breakdowns of the stories and characters that matter to us. Until next time, this has been Star Lore. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember that your worth isn't defined by what you can do, but by who you choose to be. Thanks for watching.